The Department of Justice has posted 3 FBI interviews online related to sexual assault allegations against President Trump. They'd previously been missing from the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. Now, the records involve a woman who told agents she was sexually abused by Epstein and Trump starting when she was 13 years old. Yesterday, the White House called those, quote, completely baseless accusations backed by zero credible evidence. President Trump has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. It's unclear why the witness allegations against the president were not released until now.
All right, friends, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast Family. Newly released FBI records contain a staggering volume of Trump references, including an allegation from a woman who says she was sexually assaulted by both Epstein and Trump when she was between 13 and 15, preserved in interview summaries previously withheld under a now admitted incorrect justification. The document dump could fundamentally alter Trump's political future. The sheer scale of Trump's presence in these documents is genuinely staggering and deserves to be understood before we even get to the specific allegations. A New York Times review found more than 5,300 separate files and tens of thousands of individual references involving Trump, his businesses, and Mar-a-Lago within the Justice Department's Epstein document releases. CNN and other outlets separately report that Trump's name appears more than 10,000 times across the 3 million document tranche released in early 2026. That volume alone establishes something this series has covered before, but deserves restating with precision. Trump's association with Epstein, in terms of sheer documentary presence, was extensive, far beyond what his public characterizations have generally suggested. We're not talking about a passing acquaintance or a casual social connection. We're talking about a documented relationship that generated enough paper to fill thousands of files and tens of thousands of separate references.
The Justice Department released a batch of previously unreleased documents from the Epstein files that include notes from FBI interviews with a woman who says she was assaulted by President Trump as a minor. In interviews with the FBI, the woman alleged she was assaulted by Mr. Trump in the 1980s and that she was also a victim of Epstein's. The documents were released after multiple news outlets discovered they were missing from the initial mass release of files. For more, we're joined now by our Justice correspondent, Ali Rogan. So, Ali, tell us more about what's in these documents.
Jeff, these documents are known as 302 files. They're summaries of 3 interviews the FBI conducted with this accuser, in which she alleges that Epstein brought her to meet Trump sometime between when she was age 13 and 15. She details in very graphic terms Trump's alleged sexual assault against her and how she fought back. She also says she had 2 additional interactions with Trump.
But the specific new development that demands the most careful treatment is the FBI records themselves. In March 2026, the Department of Justice released FBI interview summaries from 2019 involving a woman who alleged she was introduced to Trump by Epstein and subsequently assaulted by both men at an age between 13 and 15. I'm going to state that plainly and move forward without repeating the specific graphic details contained in those records because this channel doesn't believe reproducing that level of detail serves any informational purpose beyond what's necessary to understand the seriousness of the allegation. Reproducing those specifics risks exactly the kind of sensationalizing treatment that serious abuse allegations deserve to be protected from. What matters for this story is this. The DOJ says these specific files were previously wrongly labeled duplicative and omitted from earlier public releases.
But before she expanded on that any further, she asked if she could go on to another subject. During the last interview with the accuser, the FBI asked if she would be comfortable sharing more about her contacts with Trump. She said at the time that she didn't know what the point would be when there was a strong possibility nothing could be done about it, and it's unclear, Jeff, if there was any additional follow-up after that last interview.
Why weren't these documents initially released?
These 3 summaries are actually part of a set of 4, and that other document was released as part of that initial major tranche we saw in late January. That summary was an interview in which the accuser focused on Epstein and didn't mention Trump. These others, of course, mention the Trump allegations. Reporters caught this discrepancy because descriptions of all 4 summaries of the interviews were included in a list that was given to attorneys for Epstein co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell.
That means material connected to this specific allegation existed and was kept out of public view before finally being released in March 2026. Now, the DOJ's own position deserves to be stated for balance and precision. The Justice Department has said some released documents contain, in its own words, false and sensational claims against President Trump, and has stressed that investigators found insufficient credible evidence to bring charges against him. That's DOJ's own stated conclusion, and it deserves to be reported precisely alongside everything else in this story. No charges have been filed, and DOJ's own assessment is that available evidence doesn't meet the threshold required for criminal prosecution. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has repeatedly said Trump did nothing wrong, reiterating his account that he expelled Epstein from Mar-a-Lago, characterizing him as a pedophile and creep. But here's where it gets complicated. Emails and logs reviewed by NPR show Trump continuing to appear in Epstein-related discussions for years afterward, a specific tension in the timeline that raises questions the current public account hasn't fully addressed.
In a statement released on social media, the Department of Justice said the interviews had been incorrectly deemed duplicative and were subsequently published. The DOJ also says that the unredacted versions of the documents will be available for members of Congress to review, but reporters have noted that even still, there are additional documents that remain missing. Independent journalist Roger Sollenberger has been following this closely, and he noted that there are at least 37 pages still missing. That includes notes that informed these summaries, as well as internal communication that would memorialize how the situation with the accuser was resolved.
What's the White House saying about all of this?
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt put out a statement in which she calls the accusations completely baseless, and she says they come from a, quote, sadly disturbed woman who has an extensive criminal history.
If the accuser is unidentified, how would she know that to be true?
There are some details in the summaries of these interviews in which the accuser talks about her arrests as a minor. While these allegations remain uncorroborated, there is new reporting, Jeff, tonight from Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald, who's broken much of the Epstein story, saying that DOJ officials who spoke to this woman found her to be credible and that they wouldn't have interviewed her 4 times if they didn't.
Let's take apart the full scope of this story with the precision it demands. The document mislabeling issue deserves scrutiny first because it's the piece of this story with the most direct institutional accountability implications, separate from the underlying allegation itself. DOJ's own explanation that files connected to this specific allegation were wrongly labeled duplicative and omitted from earlier releases deserves serious examination on its own institutional terms. Understand what duplicative labeling means in a document release context. It's a classification typically used to indicate that a specific document's content is already captured elsewhere in the release, making a separate publication redundant rather than necessary. If FBI interview records summarizing a serious sexual assault allegation were mislabeled this way and consequently withheld from the initial release,
newly released documents that were missing from the Epstein files contain serious unverified allegations against President Trump. The Justice Department posted 3 FBI memos describing interviews with a woman who accuses both Jeffrey Epstein and President Trump of sexually assaulting her when she was a teenager. The White House calls the accusations completely baseless. CNN's Paula Reed is in Washington with the latest. And Paula, these were missing from earlier file releases, right?
That's right. And this individual was interviewed by the FBI 4 times. And initially, only 1 memo was released in that initial batch of documents released by the Justice Department. And that was an interview where she made allegations against Jeffrey Epstein, but not against President Trump. Now, yesterday, these additional summaries were released, and they detail the types of allegations that she made against President Trump, where she describes being introduced to him. She alleges that he asked everyone to leave the room and, quote,
that represents either a genuine administrative error at significant scale or something more troubling. This series has already documented in earlier coverage a broader pattern. Missing interview records specifically connected to allegations against Trump. A broader 13-file disappearance the DOJ never fully explained. A photo removal and restoration sequence that didn't cleanly match stated justifications. This new mislabeling admission fits directly into that same now well-documented pattern of Trump-connected material specifically being omitted from public Epstein disclosures under justifications that don't always always fully withstand scrutiny. The pattern is becoming impossible to ignore. Each new disclosure reveals another previously hidden file, another mislabeled record, another explanation that raises more questions than it answers. Now, the volume of Trump references deserves to be understood in context rather than simply repeated. 5,300 files and tens of thousands of references appearing across a 3 million document release establishes that Trump's presence in this material is genuinely extensive. Not a passing mention here and there, but a documented recurring presence across the entire scope of Epstein's world as reflected in these files. That volume on its own doesn't establish any specific wrongdoing. Proximity and documented association are a different and lesser category of fact than proof of participation in any specific criminal conduct, a distinction this series has maintained consistently throughout our Epstein-related coverage. But the sheer scale does directly undercut the more minimizing public characterizations of Trump's relationship with Epstein that have circulated at various points. A passing acquaintance from Palm Beach doesn't typically generate 5,000 files worth of documentary presence. The specific tension NPR identified between Trump's public account and a documented record deserves careful attention. His consistent public claim that he expelled Epstein from Mar-a-Lago, characterizing him as a pedophile and creep, sits uneasily alongside emails and logs showing Trump continuing to appear in Epstein-related discussions for years afterward. That's a specific documented factual tension worth stating precisely. If the ban genuinely occurred at the time and for the reasons Trump has publicly claimed, the continued appearance in subsequent Epstein-related discussions requires some explanation the current public account hasn't fully addressed. This series covered a directly related thread in an earlier script. Trump's Truth Social denial about banning Epstein, deleted within hours after newly unsealed SDNY documents directly contradicted that specific timeline plane. The pattern of denial followed by documentation that contradicts the denial is itself a recurring theme worth tracking. The congressional pressure deserves attention as the formal accountability mechanism currently in motion. The Epstein Files Transparency Act, passed in 2025, legally requires DOJ to release unclassified Epstein-related material. This series covered the bipartisan origins of that legislation in earlier scripts, including a Republican senator's own public push for greater transparency. Democrats and some Republicans now specifically accuse the administration of dragging its feet and mislabeling sensitive records to keep them from public view. Language that directly connects to the mislabeling admission the story documents regarding the specific assault-related interviews. A bipartisan House petition reaching at least 218 signatures demanding fuller disclosure represents genuine documented cross-party pressure. Not a partisan effort, but a coalition spanning both parties, specifically because the underlying transparency concern has generated agreement across the political spectrum. That bipartisan character is itself significant because it means this pressure can't be dismissed as purely partisan opposition. The Epstein email quotes about Trump deserve precise, careful sourcing given their origin. NPR's reporting cites Epstein's own emails describing Trump as, in Epstein's specific words, the dog that hasn't barked, and separately, as bad as Trump with not one decent cell in his body. These are Epstein's own characterizations of Trump found within his own correspondence, worth understanding as exactly that. One specific, deeply compromised individual's private assessment of Trump, not independently verified fact about Trump's actual conduct or character. Epstein's own credibility as a source is obviously profoundly compromised by his own documented crimes. This series maintains that same caution here that we've applied throughout our Epstein coverage. Reporting what the emails say precisely, while not treating Epstein's own characterizations as verified truth, simply because they appear in release documents. The distraction analysis connects directly to material the series has traced extensively across coverage of foreign policy and domestic attention patterns. Reports indicate that following the most recent Trump-backed military campaign against Iran, search interest in the Epstein files specifically dipped, with analysts suggesting Trump desperately needs a distraction from domestic challenges and may be using foreign policy to shift public attention away from the documents. That's an analytical inference about attention patterns and possible motive, worth holding as informed speculation rather than proven fact. This series can't independently verify Trump's specific intent behind any foreign policy decision and won't claim to. But the coincidence of timing is worth noting. Major foreign policy actions emerging precisely as damaging domestic disclosures surface has been a recurring pattern across Trump's political career. Let me break down what this combined story actually means, holding every thread with the precision this subject matter requires. The underlying assault allegation remains an unproven allegation. DOJ's own stated conclusion is that available evidence doesn't meet the threshold for criminal charges. This series states that plainly and repeats it because precision matters more here than almost anywhere else in our entire coverage. The document mislabeling issue is a separate, independently significant institutional accountability question, regardless of the underlying allegation's ultimate merits. Material connected to a serious allegation being withheld from public disclosure under a justification DOJ itself now says was applied incorrectly represents a genuine transparency failure worth scrutinizing on its own terms. Fitting directly into the broader pattern this series has documented across multiple prior Epstein file scripts. The sheer volume of Trump-related material across these releases doesn't prove any specific wrongdoing, but it does establish that his documented association with Epstein was considerably more extensive than more minimizing public characterizations have suggested. A distinction worth maintaining, precisely rather than collapsing into either extreme. The specific tension between Trump's public ban narrative and the documented continued appearances and later Epstein-related discussions deserves to remain an open, unresolved, factual question. This series flags, without claiming to definitively resolve, connecting directly to the deleted Truth Social post this series covered previously. The the public disclosure reaching at least 218 House signatures represents genuine, documented, cross-party concern about transparency, specifically distinct from any question about the underlying allegation's truth. This post ceases to the state. Epstein's own email characterizations of Trump deserve to be reported precisely as exactly what they are. One compromised, criminally convicted individual's private assessment, not independently verified fact, held with appropriate skepticism, regardless of how damning the specific language sounds. The honest boundaries restated because they matter more in this story than almost any other this series has covered. The assault allegation is a serious, documented claim. DOJ itself says lacks sufficient evidence for prosecution. Both facts stated together, precisely, without minimizing either. The document mislabeling and the broader pattern of Trump-connected material being withheld are confirmed and sourced. The volume of Trump references across the release files is confirmed. The tension between his public account and the documented record is confirmed. What remains genuinely unresolved, and this series won't claim otherwise, is the underlying truth of the specific assault allegation itself. So here's the bottom line. A new wave of Epstein-related documents has placed Trump at the center of an active, ongoing story. His usual playbook has struggled to contain more than 5,000 files and tens of thousands of references connecting him to this material. Newly released FBI records connected to a serious sexual assault allegation that DOJ itself says doesn't currently meet the threshold for criminal charges. A document mislabeling admission fitting a broader pattern this series has traced extensively. Genuine bipartisan congressional pressure demanding fuller transparency. None of that constitutes proof of the underlying allegation's truth. All of it constitutes a genuine, documented, institutional, and political crisis. That Trump's standard deflection strategy, blaming Democrats, calling it a hoax, pivoting to foreign policy, has, according to NPR's own analysis, struggled against given the sheer scale and bipartisan nature of the concern. This is a serious story, involving a serious allegation, and it deserves exactly the precision this breakdown has tried to maintain throughout. There's a broader point worth making about why the document mislabeling pattern deserves to be understood as its own significant institutional story, entirely separate from the underlying allegation's ultimate resolution. This series has now documented this exact pattern recurring across multiple separate contexts within the same broader Epstein disclosure fight. We covered in an earlier script the missing FBI interview records connected to a different accuser, the 13 unexplained vanished files, and the Trump photo removed and later restored after officials admitted no victims appeared in it. This new mislabeling admission, specifically affecting records connected to this particular assault allegation, adds another documented instance to that same pattern. Meaning it's no longer possible to characterize any single instance as an isolated administrative error. A pattern recurring this many times across this many separate specific instances involving this many separate categories of material connected to Trump specifically represents a genuine documented institutional tendency worth naming precisely. DOJ's public disclosure process, whatever its stated justifications in any individual instance, has repeatedly and specifically underperformed when it comes to releasing Trump-connected Epstein material compared to how thoroughly other threads within the same broader document releases have been made public. It's also worth examining why the specific choice to withhold graphic details of the underlying allegation from this breakdown reflects a deliberate editorial standard this channel maintains consistently, rather than any attempt to minimize the allegation's seriousness. Serious sexual abuse allegations, particularly those involving alleged minors, carry genuine risk of being sensationalized or exploited when specific graphic mechanics get repeated and amplified across commentary content, regardless of the commentator's stated intent. This channel's standard throughout its entire run has been to report what's confirmed, state allegations precisely without embellishment, and avoid reproducing specific graphic details that don't add informational value beyond what's necessary to understand a story's actual stakes and significance. That standard applies here with particular weight precisely because the underlying allegation is this serious, and precisely because sensationalized treatment of exactly this kind of material is part of what makes political commentary genuinely harmful when it prioritizes viral engagement over responsible, careful reporting. There's also a useful point worth making about how the 218 House signatures specifically connect to the broader legislative mechanics this series has documented extensively across our impeachment cluster coverage. 218 represents a working majority threshold in the current House of Representatives, meaning this specific petition, if its signatures hold and translate into an actual procedural vote, potentially represents genuine legislative momentum toward forcing additional disclosure. Distinct from the more symbolic individual member statements and filed resolutions this series has documented elsewhere throughout our extensive impeachment mechanics coverage. That specific numerical threshold deserves attention precisely because it represents something closer to an actual working majority than the individual pressure campaigns and filed resolutions this series has more typically documented across other Trump-related congressional accountability efforts. It's worth applying the same verification framework this series has maintained throughout every prior script to any future claims circulating about this specific story, with even more caution given how serious the underlying subject matter is. Ask whether any claimed new detail about the assault allegation is attributed to actual source FBI documents or credible news reporting, rather than speculation or unverified claims circulating online. Ask whether any claimed additional missing or mislabeled file is confirmed by independent journalistic verification, exactly the standard this script applied throughout. And recognize that this story's genuine seriousness, a documented allegation, a documented pattern of institutional omission, genuine bipartisan pressure for transparency, doesn't require any additional embellishment or graphic detail to be significant. The confirmed facts alone constitute a real ongoing crisis worth taking seriously, without exaggeration in either direction. Watch these specific developments going forward because this remains a genuinely active, evolving story with real institutional stakes. Watch whether DOJ provides the kind of detailed, document-specific accounting for this and other mislabeling instances that critics have specifically demanded. That accounting will represent the clearest test of whether these were genuine administrative errors or something more troubling. Watch whether the 218-signature petition translates into an actual forced disclosure vote, given that specific numerical threshold's proximity to a genuine working majority. And watch whether any additional formally mislabeled or omitted files continued to other allegations continue surfacing. Since the pattern this series has now documented across multiple separate instances suggests the specific story is far from finished unfolding. Let's also spend time examining why DOJ's own insufficient credible evidence standard deserves precise understanding as a specific legal threshold, rather than being read as either a full exoneration or dismissive cover-up characterization. Both extremes misrepresent what this specific institutional conclusion actually establishes. Insufficient credible evidence to bring charges is a stated prosecutorial judgment about whether available evidence meets the specific legal burden required to pursue a criminal case successfully. It's a distinct and considerably higher standard than simply whether an allegation might be true, or even whether internal investigators found the underlying account credible on some level. Prosecutors declined to bring charges for many reasons entirely separate from disbelieving an allegation. Evidentiary challenges specific to decades-old conduct, witness availability and reliability over such extended time periods, and the specific corroboration requirements criminal prosecution demands that civil proceedings or journalistic investigation don't require to the same degree. That doesn't mean DOJ's conclusions should be read skeptically as necessarily incorrect. It's a genuine stated institutional judgment deserving real weight, but it also doesn't mean the underlying allegation has been disproven or found false. It means the specific narrow legal threshold for criminal prosecution wasn't met, which is a meaningfully different and narrower conclusion than a broader finding that nothing improper occurred. This distinction matters enormously when evaluating the significance of these documents and the allegations they contain. It's also worth examining why the specific years-long gap between the alleged conduct and its public documentation deserves careful, precise treatment. This pattern recurs across many historical sexual abuse cases and shouldn't be treated as itself suspicious or as automatically undermining the allegation's credibility. Survivors of sexual abuse frequently take extended periods, sometimes decades, before coming forward publicly or to law enforcement. A well-documented pattern across countless verified cases throughout the broader movement and long before it, driven by genuine psychological, social, and practical barriers to immediate disclosure that trauma researchers have extensively documented. The specific timeline here, the underlying allegation dating back years, the 2019 FBI interviews, and now the March 2026 document release, reflects the broader, well-established pattern of how these cases typically surface and get investigated over extended periods, rather than representing any unusual or suspicious delay specific to this particular allegation. There's a useful point worth making about how this specific story connects to the broader pattern this series has traced extensively regarding the gap between Trump's public characterizations and documented reality across virtually every domain we've examined throughout this entire project. We've documented the tariff foreign country payments framing against the actual domestic tax mechanism, the packed with happy people claim against documented empty fairgrounds. And now the specific tension between the public Epstein ban narrative and documented continued appearances in later discussions. Each instance shares a similar underlying structure. A specific falsifiable factual claim made publicly and repeatedly that documented records and independent verification directly contradict. That consistency across such varied domains, economic policy, event attendance, and now personal historical conduct, suggests this represents a genuine, consistent pattern in how Trump manages public narratives generally, rather than any single instance representing an isolated exception. It's worth considering with appropriate gravity what genuine institutional accountability might actually look like for the document mislabeling pattern this series has now traced across multiple separate instances, distinct from any resolution of the underlying allegations themselves. This series has documented across our broader accountability coverage how congressional oversight, inspector general reviews, and continued independent journalism function as the primary mechanisms available when executive branch disclosure practices come under this kind of sustained scrutiny. The Epstein Files Transparency Act itself represents exactly this kind of institutional accountability mechanism already in motion, legally requiring disclosure that DOJ's own admitted mislabeling errors repeatedly undermined. Whether that legal requirement, combined with the bipartisan congressional pressure and continued independent reporting this story has generated, eventually produces a more complete and reliable accounting of what DOJ's files actually contain, remains genuinely uncertain. Consistent with the pattern this series has traced across virtually every accountability mechanism we've examined throughout this project, real documented pressure doesn't guarantee any particular timeline for resolution. But it does create a permanent, citable record that outlasts any single news cycle. So here's the final complete framework worth carrying forward from this careful examination. A new wave of Epstein-related documents has genuinely placed Trump at the center of an active, serious, ongoing story. More than 5,000 files and tens of thousands of references connecting him to this material. Newly released FBI records connected to a serious sexual assault allegation that DOJ's own insufficient credible evidence standard means hasn't met the threshold for criminal prosecution. A document mislabeling admission fitting a now well-documented broader pattern this series has traced across multiple separate instances. Genuine bipartisan congressional pressure backed by a 218-signature House petition demanding fuller transparency. Every one of those threads deserves to be held precisely. The allegation remains unproven. DOJ's own stated conclusion is real and carries genuine institutional weight. The mislabeling pattern is independently documented and troubling, regardless of the underlying allegations' resolution. The sheer volume of Trump-related material undercuts the more minimizing public characterizations that have circulated. This is a serious story about a serious allegation, institutional transparency failures, and genuine bipartisan demand for accountability. It deserves exactly that treatment, and nothing more sensationalized than the confirmed facts themselves already warrant. That's the accurate, careful, complete version of this story, and it's one that will continue to unfold as more documents surface and more questions demand answers. The Epstein saga isn't over. It's entering a new and potentially more consequential chapter, and everyone involved should be paying very close attention.